You know somebody's going to get killed in a war. You know somebody's going to get killed in uh, the violent answer. In the peaceable answer, what you're holding out is the possibility that violence need not occur. And that is an opportunity that most people, given that opportunity, will take it. Not everybody, you may end up dead, but that's the point of the cross, is that we're willing to risk everything for the peace and love of Christ.
Right. Well, I'm glad to have our returning guest, Dr. Paul Axton, joining me. He is the host of the podcast Forging Plowshares. He's also a theological teacher and professor. What would you say? What's the name of your organization where you can join your classes?
So we have Plowshares Bible Institute. We teach, have certificates and classes. Got a couple of upcoming classes. Focus this year mainly on William Desmond. William Desmond himself, who maybe some have said the most prominent living philosopher, is going to teach a class for us. And then prior to that, one of his, a student of Desmond, is going to give us a course kind of introducing peace and how nonviolence then ties into Desmond and actually Rowan Williams, but others through the history of the church.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so he's considered the most important philosopher for all philosophy, or just within the Christian context, or what?
Well, I have read quotes that he is the most prominent Irish philosopher.
Wow.
He is the most prominent uh, uh, he's a Christian philosopher. So I'm sure that, depending on your perspective, but in the area that I'm working in theology, Desmond has done something that is unique in he's expanded what might be called a speculative philosophy. That is, he's done a project on the order, if you go back historically, somebody like Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, whatever your view of Hegel, what Hegel was, he's written this huge corpus of work. And Desmond has written, he's also has just a huge body of work, but he's taking a very orthodox Christian understanding, and on that, kind of building on that understanding is describing metaphysics, describing, the human condition, human personality. And so as far as just the volume of work and the theological groundedness of his work, I think that he is a very significant
Mhm.
philosophical thinker for theology.
Yeah. What does he bring to theology that's been missing so far, you think?
Well, in the history of the church, what takes place is we have a kind of divide, and you really can't. We tend to divide up philosophy and theology, but what happened philosophically happened theologically, and that is that we get a division between the finite and the infinite. And you can describe that, division between heaven and earth, soul, body. You can describe those dualisms in any number of ways. And so that unfolded in various philosophical and theological understandings. In philosophical modernity, we have someone like Rene Descartes, who talks about, Descartes is a good Catholic thinker, but he pictures thinking the world away in order to obtain God. You enter into the mind. And so there's this clear division in modernity. And that then gets taken up in various theological understandings in which redemption becomes focused on the soul or on the interior rather than a holistic embodied salvation. A lot of Christian pietism, actually this country is just steeped in this kind of focus on the individual, the soul going to heaven, a kind of disembodied Christianity. So that what happened philosophically has been reflected theologically and vice versa. And the way that that has tended to function, in someone like Anselm of Canterbury, who is actually pre-modern, but Anselm gives us a kind of, he gives us the ontological argument and the philosophical argument based on ontology. And so there is a grounding in what is called philosophically metaphysics. That is, that we imagine in a metaphysical or in Anselm taken up into the modern period, that we can kind of argue on the basis of pure reason or on the basis of metaphysics alone that we can argue to God.
Yeah.
What happens in postmodernism, that has fallen apart.
Yeah.
In other words, that kind of a philosophical rationalism or a theological rationalism has fallen apart. What William Desmond has done is, many theologians kind of went along with the idea of an abandonment of metaphysics, of that kind of thinking. But Desmond has returned to a reorientation to metaphysics. I mean, in reality, you can't do away with thinking and thought and being and just these basic categories. But he's redefined them, described them, I think, in very Christian terms, that there is this kind of fullness of agape love and what he calls the metaxological. That is, that he actually dwells a lot with Hegel in dealing with the dialectic, but where Hegel is often seen as himself a metaphysical philosopher, Desmond has said, well, we dwell in between. That is, that there is no a final synthesis, but that we're in between, and that in between, that gap or that crack, however you describe it in everything, that's precisely the place in which we meet God, we encounter other people. That's just the nature of the human condition. And it's not a place of emptiness like somebody like Zizek would describe it, but it's a place of fullness, of mystery, and it is a place of divine encounter. What Desmond calls it a godsend, that God kind of hits us, in various ways, and our world is changed up, and we become aware. Maybe one world. The comparison I've recently done, I don't know if you've ever read Flannery O'Connor, but he's a great fan of Flannery O'Connor and especially her story Revelation. In that story, is this woman who's kind of a racist Southern woman who thinks of herself as a good Christian. And then her world comes undone and is turned on its head, functioning very much. I think Flannery O'Connor functions very much in a contemporary setting, very much like Jesus' parables are meant to function. The world kind of holds together for people around the law, around, being Jewish or whatever they are, being the son of in the story of the prodigal son. And that world falls apart, and then a new world then from that crack and opening unfolds. So it's a kind of a beautiful way of describing conversion or metanoia.
Yeah, it sounds like apocalypse too, the unveiling of that which is hidden.
Very much an apocalyptic remaking of the world and of our kind of lawful rule-based conception of the world.
It reminds me of that book by a Christian theologian named David Dark called Everyday Apocalypse, I think, where he studies Flannery O'Connor and The Simpsons and some other apocalyptic art and kind of shows this inbreaking of the extraordinary through the ordinary and all this. So is he kind of talking about an enchantment of the world? Is that a way to look at it?
Well, he Desmond is very much dealing with Charles Taylor's. Taylor is the one who gives us a picture of the unfolding of the secular age, and I think that our world, depending on what you mean by it, has certainly been disenchanted. So that we're at one point it would have been impossible not to believe in God. Today, it's very difficult for most people to believe in God. And so we've just lost that sensibility that the world's, God's glory, the world is lit up with the grandeur of God. And so Desmond is very much aware of that secular view and the sense in which we live in that secular view. And so you could almost see, or actually Ryan Duns, who is a student of Desmond, has taken up Taylor's project and shown how Desmond fills in where, Taylor is describing, how do we regain is the question. How do we regain that enchantment uh, with God? And Ryan Dunn sees Desmond as fulfilling that project that Taylor points to.
I bet that fits nicely with, the Rene Girard anthropology that we explore. Fits
Very
good.
much so. So Gerard's picture, of course, is kind of the dark picture that we often work with. That how does society function? Well, once you do Gerard, you just see scapegoating everywhere, and we understand that our world is held together by a kind of violence, and we make sense out of it violently, that we kind of extract the meaning through the sacrifice. And I appreciate Anthony Bartlett in this, in that I think he has taken Gerard a step further. Uh, Gerard was not a pacifist. Gerard was not nonviolent. And I think that Bartlett it takes the gospel and shows us how that the Gerardian understanding, or we might even, this is sort of the way that I use Zizek. I think you almost have to get that dark picture that's there in Flannery O'Connor, the kind of the racist Southern woman who thinks she can't see herself. She can't understand that her whole world, her own sensibility, is held together by a kind of hierarchy or rationality that is just violent, that is degrading, that is, almost inhuman. And I think that you almost have to go as dark as Flannery O'Connor does in order to come to the hope. And so I see Slavoj Žižek as kind of that dark side of the Gerardian understanding. And I would see, what somebody like William Desmond encompassing that in a Christian hope and bringing light into that dark place. But you almost have to pass through. You have to understand. I don't think for most of us, that darkness and the way in which it pins our world, it's kind of the point at which things hold together. Uh, and once we see what that is, that quill, what in Lacanian theory is called the quilting point. That quilting point, once it comes unraveled, uh, and it easily, once you delve into human personality, you delve into culture, then very, very often that's that point of in which everything is tied together comes undone. I think you almost have to you have to be exposed to the darkness of the human condition. And I think Gerard is key in that.
Yeah, I think that the world is just starting to scratch the surface in terms of the intellectual world and also the broader world into the implications of Rene Girard's work. And I'm not as familiar, I don't know much about Desmond other than what you've said. It'll be interesting to see what he has to add to the conversation. So people can go to, when is he going to do the class? I want to give people a chance to join your class if they want.
Ethan Vanderleek, you can go to Plowshares Bible Institute, go to course offerings, and you can register for that course now. Just if you've never filled out an application, it's not that we're weeding anybody out. It's just
Is
we
there any
get
sacrificial violence in your
no,
application?
no, Zach. We just get people's basic information. You fill out the application, submit the application if you've never done that, and then you can register for the course. And that course will start April 8th.
Yeah. You'd said, I think, to me in the past, I don't know if it was on I think it was on one of our shows. No, probably not. But you said that when you first read the Bible, you were what, 9 years old or 13? What was it?
I was 13, yeah.
And you read the Bible cover to cover?
I did not because that may this was all new for me. I was kind of a pagan little kid, I had kind of lived for only being 13, I had managed to get into a lot of trouble in my
What are you
short
doing?
13.
Going to the bars and brawling people?
Well, I wasn't quite old enough for that, but it was the 60s and the drug culture, and I kind of got even very early got into that. So I
Where were you
managed to.
growing up in?
Well,
Missouri?
this was in Phoenix, Arizona,
Well,
and
that's a
so
rough place, I hear.
well, it can be, and so we moved. My I was causing so much trouble.
Were your parents strict on you or very easy?
Well, they became. I think I always kind of credit myself for I was so bad that I kind of brought them. They had their own Jesus moment, and that included me. And so, yeah, my father was he worked away, he was uh uh he not my parents weren't separated or anything. He
Yeah.
just by the necessity of work, he was living in Texas. And so they I went to Texas, and that's where I had I found Christ. I had a conversion experience. And so I often I talk about Texas as key because that was really where you know, uh, that I had my life that was my godsend moment.
What happened?
That was the first one, but
You went to
that
a
was
Billy Graham crusade one night with your hat in hand?
it wasn't, there was a Texas evangelist. I don't know if you ever heard of James Robinson. He's pretty famous
Was
in
he tent
Texas.
style like Billy Sunday?
He he had his own, yeah, he preached a revival in our high school during school hours to give you an idea of the Texas that I was in. And then he continued the revival in the evenings. I actually had become a Christian before that, but I did go forward at his revival meeting, and that I must admit that shaped my childish concept. I had been baptized prior to that, but Texas evangelical Christianity was the thing that I was steeped in as a young
They
Christian.
cleaned you up a little bit, didn't they?
They tried, yeah, yeah. But we lived out in the country and we had horses and I kind of I developed my
What
own.
part of Texas were you in? You in
This
Amarillo?
was this was north of Amarillo in Dalhart, Texas. It was up in the Panhandle. I don't know if you've ever read the Larry McMurtry novels, but in what is called the Staked Plains. When the Comanches are running from the cowboys, they ride out into the Staked Plains. That's where I, that's where we were because it was a virtual desert. It was a very harsh place. But I developed a deep spiritual connectedness to the plains and to that part of Texas. And more than church, my time in on the prairie, me and my horse and my dogs may have been more of a shaping experience. And that it was in that context that I sat down and read the Bible because I thought, you know, I I knew nothing. I didn't, I was literally almost a blank slate in terms of what this stuff was. And so I was just trying to figure it out.
Were you
And,
listening to like the hippie music while you were listening to while you're reading the Bible, or what are you doing?
you know,
Were you be would you be considered trad and straight laced for your time, or when you got to Christ, or were you a Jesus people Christian?
I kind of tread the line because, that in Texas there
I don't mean
weren't.
this as a pejorative, but then that's kind of like maybe like Forrest Gump, where you can hang out with the hippies, but you also have the nice crew cut. Remember that?
Yeah,
Remember that
yeah,
character?
yeah,
He's hanging out with the
yeah.
hippies, but he's still straight laced and all shucks.
Yeah, the Jesus people thing was kind of happening, and that was not, that of course in Texas that didn't exist, but
Yeah.
later when I was in Kansas, that kind of countercultural Christianity, I don't know that I would call us, I don't know that we were aware of it in the way that it came to be characterized later. But the drug culture meets youth culture, that was everywhere. That was just all of us. And we were all trying to find our way. We Most of the people, like we started a little commune when I moved to Texas or to Kansas. But we were I think we were pretty straight-laced people, but we were also there was a new spirituality that we all felt it, that there was something happening
Yeah.
to many of us. And
It wasn't just the MK Ultra either. There was something else really going on.
it was everybody,
Yeah.
everybody came out of most of the people that I was connected with had a church that they had been a part of, but none of us felt any great loyalty to any of that. In fact, we began to meet in a Catholic monastery. We began to meet in a nunnery. So we there was not even the Protestant Catholic
Why did
feel.
the nuns let you do that? I thought they're pretty strict about who can come in and stuff.
I've kind of forgotten, but they had an empty building, an empty room, and even after I left Kansas, they continued it. So, but it was on, I don't know, the Catholic church there had a property. It's been 50, more than 50 years ago.
Yeah.
It's grown a little dim in my mind, but how we ended up on that
I
in that
want to
pro
ask a question since, I'm trying to land the plane here to somewhere we're going to go. But first, I wanted to ask you about you said you read the Bible when you were 12, right?
13.
13. So you said you came away from the book concluding that it basically taught nonviolence or peace.
Yeah, I don't know how you can conclude otherwise once
How,
you go.
but I want to, but just how did you get through all those Old Testament books where it's just God tells me to slaughter this guy and I was cursed because I didn't slaughter this guy quick enough. The Lord told me to kill him and I didn't kill him fast enough and then I got cursed. And Yahweh said, "Send me 75 virgins and 50 fatted calf when you slaughter those people." How did you get through all that and then get to I know the New Testament's got some nice stuff in there, but then you end up with Revelation. How does a 12-year-old still conclude nonviolence out of that whole journey? Just curious.
Well, I can't I probably can't explain it myself other than to say I did when I say I read it, that didn't mean that I understood it. And what I did understand and what was crystal clear to me was the teaching of Jesus. That other stuff I didn't quite know what to make of. But by the time you get to the Sermon on the Mount, by the time you get to the New Testament, as a child at 13, I understood this was key. And so whatever that other stuff was, I understood that this trumps it. In other words, it's more important, and that we're going to interpret. I didn't make much sense of it actually,
Yeah.
but I did. The teaching of Jesus made a world of sense to me, and I understood that, you know, that it was, turn the other cheek, go the second mile, the take up your cross and follow me.
Yeah.
There's no ambiguity there. That's not hard. Even a child can understand that.
Do you think children would are in general, our children and teenagers and stuff, are they well suited to read the Old Testament and all the way through like that? And just like, do you think that's helpful for them?
No, I don't. In other words, I think that especially the way that in our popular culture that these Old Testament characters and Old Testament stories can be glorified, that in fact it's not Christian. I don't think that David killing, the giant, killing Goliath, or I don't think that, Joshua going into Jericho, that may make for a great cinematic kind of understanding. But of course, that you're not going to understand that story as being of equal weight with the story of Christ.
Right.
And I didn't until I went to Bible college, and then I think I got, that thing that I'd come to. First of all, as a child picking up the Bible, I think it's clear there, that, well, the New Testament, that the Gospels are key. The teachings of Jesus are key. In a seminary education or a Bible college education, strangely enough, that's not going to hold true. Now, it's taken away from you in very subtle ways, but what will happen is this flattening out. I didn't read the Bible in a flat way. And I don't think we're supposed to. But I think one of the things that has happened in evangelicalism, in a lot of Christianity, is a kind of flattening out of Revelation. And part of that is this kind of modernist
You know about
understanding.
Revelation in general or the book of
Yeah, the
Revelation?
Bible, the whole Bible. So,
Well,
yeah,
I'm going some here with this. Is like, do you think though that the art, you know, I believe that the art of the anthology of the Bible is meant to show you, of course, how man wrestled with God and who God was and who He was, who mankind was. And so you're seeing that preserved in the Old Testament, so that you don't have to get such a radical nonviolent gospel shoved down your throat in some kind of a revolutionary sense, like what the victimists, as Gerard would call them, have done through history. You need the Old Testament to school you to the nested truth of the grace in some sense. So, like for a child, is there any utility, do you think, for a child to learn about the Goliath story in the sense of being brave to confront, big challenges or bullies, I mean, if you see Goliath as a figure, as an archetype for an oppressor,
yeah.
does the Goliath story help you confront the KKK if you were around that time in Texas? I'm saying, I'm just making an allegory right now, but you know what I mean? Does that give you is there something kind of redemptive about those stories, training you at a lower level to learn law first, and then to learn wisdom later, and learn the kind of higher wisdom of Christ even later, as you kind of get these nested truths as you grow up, and growing up chronologically in your age, and also just growing up in your mind and spirit. Is that the effect of the art that we shouldn't discard, or is it still too dangerous because of how how we tend to read it so flat? You know.
Yeah, part of it I can only say what happened to me, uh, that in my ignorance, which in many ways was a kind of blessed ignorance. But is there, yeah, I think that there's some truth in what you're saying, that in those stories, that I think we can all, like the David and Goliath, that there's a certain honor and bravery and a willingness to face the enemy. But of course, once you add Christ into that, we face down our giants, not
Hmm.
through the slingshot, but through the cross. And
Yeah.
that's an enabling. I'm not very handy with a slingshot, uh, but we can all be handy with the cross. So yeah, I think maybe there's an element of, first of all, that there is the kingdom of this world and there is the kingdom of God, and that we have to be willing to engage in the confrontation between the two.
Yeah. And of course, nonviolence. I mean, I don't know. I've debated my mind about these terms, so I don't really care what people's hard. I don't like to get really too hardened about my definitions, but I think there's a difference between nonviolence and pacifism. But I don't want to make these things too hard distinctions. But I would think that you would probably say you're not talking about if someone's coming into your house and they're trying to kidnap your kid or hurt your family, that you have no right to physically restrain the person and stop the violence, right? That's not what you're talking about.
Yeah, that when you, yeah, there may be a form of active resistance that is inclusive of nonviolence. So that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know what I might do, but uh, part of this, I don't know. You indicated you listening to our podcast recently with John Ashworth
Yeah,
in Sudan.
yeah.
And of course, what you discover in somebody like John, in that, I mean, a place of terrible violence.
Sudan, yeah, context. He was in Sudan, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so he, even I just saw in the news today, Sudan is still, in the news. So what he described to us is he didn't go to Sudan as a non advocating nonviolence. He came to the understanding, he went there as a good Catholic and believing in just war, and thought that, the Southern Sudanese actually had a just cause. But then as things developed, he realized, oh, this thing is never going to end. There's the violence just, and so he actually came to nonviolence as a mode of peacemaking. Now, he did say, he did embrace that also as a spiritual understanding. So there's been a lot written, by more than I've read. He was quoting people, Chenoweth, who I've not read, but people who have done entire studies of the effectiveness of nonviolent peacemaking. Now, once you say nonviolent, everybody thinks, oh, that limits you. But of course, that doesn't limit you at all. That is just an opening to everything else other than killing the enemy.
Yeah.
Which, once you put it that way,
Right.
are there other alternatives other than shooting each other,
Yeah.
other than whacking,
But so it's not an absolute refusal to use defensive force when appropriate. It's just about not leading with that force, not initiating aggression or vengeance, right? Those types of things.
I think that it's the in other words, once you fall back into you've lost. In terms of the gospel, I mean, that should be clear to
Well, I don't, but you're
everybody.
not saying that like, okay, again, I know this. I'm just trying to think for the way some people who would be resistant to what we're saying, they would say, okay, someone's assaulting an old lady, and you say, I will do everything but grab the person, slam them on the ground, put them in a headlock. That doesn't mean that I've failed the gospel to do that, protecting that woman. You're not saying that, right?
You
Because
know,
I
I've
like to boil things down for, so people can get to clarity what we're saying.
David, you're a bigger guy than I am, but I bet I've intervened in more fights than you have.
Right.
And
So
it
you're
doesn't
okay
matter.
with that, is what you're saying. Yeah.
It's okay with me, and it doesn't take much.
Yeah.
You know, if people in a situation like that, everybody's afraid,
Yeah.
and that's what you understand very quickly. These people are afraid, and this is the reason they're striking out violently. And all you got to do is step in there and offer an alternative. And I'm an old guy now, but uh, it doesn't matter who you are. Anybody can be a peacemaker. I
Right.
don't. You probably could wrestle somebody to the ground. I can't do that. Just physically, I can't do that. But I think that, in fact, would escalate the violence.
Right.
So I think that there are many ways to intervening, both in a particular situation like you're describing. I think that, you may get killed, but that's okay because the alternative is, this was what John Ashworth was saying, somebody's going to get killed in a war. Somebody's going to get killed in uh, the violent answer. In the peaceable answer, what you're holding out is the possibility that violence need not occur. And that is an opportunity that most people, given that opportunity, will take it. Not everybody, you may end up dead, but that's the point of the cross, is that we're willing to risk everything for the peace and love of Christ.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people hear that and they'll say, well, look, if I happen to be on a raid to save those girls on Epstein Island, I don't care if a few people get shot on the way of getting those girls out of that island. You know what I mean? That's the way people think in America when they hear Jesus's call for nonviolence. That some people are not reasoned with. They're psychopaths. They're not, Jeffrey Epstein's not scared. That's not why he's assaulting those little kids there. And that picture of evil, yes, maybe he can be redeemed theoretically, but in the moment, sometimes justice needs to take place, and those children or victims need to just be rescued. And if you have to break a few windows and a couple arms of the guards getting them out of that island, you'll do it. Is that okay in your Christian worldview, or would you say that's still a failure to live up to the gospel?
I think that unfortunately in this country, people can't imagine even rescuing girls. It makes for good theater to do it violently. I think that in fact that there are effective ways of rescue, there are effective ways of doing things that need to be explored.
So you're just, yeah, I mean, in other words, you're saying there's a better way possibly without using some theatrical, intervention of violence.
Absolutely. Yeah. Does that mean that I always know what?
Yeah,
No, there are people that study this. There are people that this is their, it's not actually my area of expertise, but the people that we've interviewed, like John, that is his area of
yeah.
expertise. In other words, he has gone through the process. Okay, shall we have a war? And actually has cited on occasion in Sudan where he didn't, but then he came to see that option is so highly destructive. And I think that's the thing that's hidden here is violence impacts not just one generation, two generations. This thing is going to impact generation after generation. That there are just ramifications for war, for people who have died in war, People who, and actually the people who do the violence suffer more in the long term, probably, than the people they killed. That is, that PTSD, that in studies done by the military, who is it that has PTSD? If you go back to World War II and you look at the bombings
Yeah.
in England, well, everybody was exposed to terrible things, but of course, the just because you're exposed to that didn't result in PTSD. What gives rise to PTSD? And this is a colonel in the Army conducting this study. They've discovered are the people that do the killing. They're going to suffer the rest of their life, usually, unless they're already a sociopath.
Yeah.
And so that should speak to us that this isn't normal. This isn't what we were made for. I mean, in this country, it's just, we're surrounded by it. That's the only option, and that's the first option. And we can't even imagine a world that is not controlled and in which violence is not an absolute necessity. I believe that that's what the gospel is calling to us, is to reimagine the world in the way that Christ imagined it, in which it's uh, to go to the cross may be necessary to save those who are doing the crucifying.
Yeah. Yeah. People really get mad about that. They don't like that.
This is the most unpopular message there could possibly be. And that's why for, 2 millennia, the church has been, for the most part, a violent church. That's why the gospel has not really hit home for most people, because they don't understand uh, the radical nature of the kingdom that Christ is calling us to.
Yeah. And I agree, that there's this, you cannot, you cannot advocate for the man who refuses to tear his enemy apart, to the point where he'd rather let the enemy tear him apart. You can't advocate for that man by tearing your enemy apart. It's a performative contradiction. You just can't. So that's why I say about like the Nicene Creed and these things are, they're good stuff in them. But to the moment that, like you've talked about in some of your recent um, shows, that about Constantine, the moment you introduce violence to protect something that could be true and good, you start to contaminate the whole project. And when you're taking, Marcionites' homes and properties and expelling people, and you know
Yeah.
Donatists and all these people are always a prognostics. All these people are scapegoats at some point because you've sacrificed, you've betrayed Christ in the spirit of trying to defend Christ, of course, and that's not going to work.
And I think that's what I experienced. The gospel that I came to, once what enters with violence, what enters once you lose the peaceable kingdom, is you lose the security, the love. In a real sense, you can't love your enemy and kill them. You can't, and that's what we're called to love of enemy. But also just I think fear is the controlling factor. Most, we're living in a society, I don't know if you're aware of it, that is just plagued with mental illness, plagued with neurosis and
Yeah.
psychosis.
Well, the
Uh,
whole psychology field was, you were mentioning World War II. There's a great article by a guy named Matthew Crawford in unheard.com. It's called Was the Sexual Revolution a Government Psyop? And it absolutely, he documents how in World War II, they started bringing in all these, psychiatrists and psychologists, a lot of them from Eastern Europe, to help try to, convince and psychologically, mold the soldier of the future to not have such burnout over the raids. They would burn out over bombing Dresden or whatever, and they that was a problem for the military. They said, "Do we want to create a man who can just go through all the way?" And these psychologists come up with these ideas about, this kind of Freudian stuff, obsession with your, oh, the reason why they can't, go all the way is because they've got some hang up about their sexuality from their childhood, and and he documents how all of this stuff is, was commissioned by the government, starting around Truman and so forth, to replace the church. That you don't go to your priest for peacemaking between your husband and wife. You go to a psychotherapist. The psychotherapist is going to find out who's pathological, which, as Girard points out, is, psychology is a form of sacrificial violence in the sense, and the way in which it's usually, practiced and taught. It's about identifying who the sick person is and then medicating their mind, which only creates more problems for them, like you said, mental illnesses, so.
Yeah, actually, that's I kind of like Lacanian. I don't like it's the wrong word, but I think it's true in that it describes, in other words, in Lacanian theory, it's not that some people are sick, it's that everybody's sick. And that that's actually behind Freudian theory. That Freud thought in studying neurosis that he was actually just studying an archetype of the human condition. That is, the neurotic is just an example of the pervasive condition. Some people can still function in society. That was the only definition that Freud came up with. That, what is the goal of psychoanalysis? Well, actually, it's that you can be functional in the society, and that the mental sickness can become such that you become dysfunctional. And so in a true Lacanian theory, the 15-minute analysis, that the patient comes and imagines that the therapist is going to explain their problem to them, that we're going to get behind the problem. And of course, the whole point in a Lacanian theory is that's your sickness, is you think that there is some sort of theory or some sort of explanation. The nature of the sickness is such that you're continually in pursuit of that goal that will always elude you. That's a very good Christian definition of the nature of evil. What we would like to be able to do with evil is explain it. But once you've explained it, it's not evil. In other words, that evil by its very nature is absurd. It's a absurd thing. And the reason it's evil is you can't get a handle on it. You can't get a grip on it. Well, that's the description of neurosis. That's the description of the mental illness. And so the cure that, psychoanalysis so often holds out, I think is a false cure very often. I'm not saying that's too strong, but I think that a lot of therapy can help. But to imagine that some sort of theory or explanation is behind it, I think is the failure.
I'd like to see you and Dr. O'Gorley on dialogue. Have you guys talked about, the mimetic psychological theory that he developed?
Huh.
He was the contemporary of Girard. He's been on my show a few times over the years. He wrote Things Hidden with Renee, and I'd like to see what he thinks about the way you've used Lacan to help with this. I'm interested to see what he would think about that. Um, yeah, but going back to the peacemaking process in general, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you, in a practical sense, because I keep seeing all of this, the political divides, and we, we don't want to. Nobody wants to do nonviolence. We got to start somewhere, though, So we got to start somewhere, and I don't think we can be absolutist ideologues that demand everything at once. We have to deal with people where they're at.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
by the, I'm in no way advocating for a nonviolent, in other words, this thing is for Christians. This isn't, I don't see that Christianity is ever going to be a very, the real thing, the real gospel is for a minority of people. So to talk about nonviolence as an orientation, a spirituality, the way to peace, we're just talking about Christianity. And you cannot foist, in other words, in no way do it imagine that the world is going to adopt the methodology of Christ. And I think that is unrealistic. That's a part of a Constantinian mentality is that, oh, we're going to save the world in that sense. And that's what the New Testament means. There is a holistic cosmic salvation, but it is also at the same time an abandonment of that human construct of a world. In other words, that world is not salvageable. The human construct is not
Doesn't that
salvageable.
sound a little bit like not literally, but kind of like Calvinism though? There's like the limited select chosen ones are the ones that get it, and then everybody else is kind of like good
Uh,
luck.
it, yeah, it's universal, but in other words, I think the gospel is universal. It is all inclusive, but it's not all inclusive for people where they're at. It's all inclusive in that all will be brought into this kingdom. And so the reality is that we live, that there is a dark world, this is
Yeah,
the dark cosmos in John. And
yeah.
so to imagine that we can soft sell Christianity as a methodology, as a kind of foundation for a Christian nationalism, for something else is just, that's the Antichrist. That's not what Christianity is. Christianity is to call people out of one world and into another world. Now, part of that you need to say which of those is the reality. Well, it's obvious that one of those worlds is an unreality. And that's what you're calling people out of, is that unreality that may seem more real. In other words, what's more real, the White House or the church house? What's more real? The political structures of this nation state or the politics of Jesus? And I believe that God is more real. I believe that Jesus Christ is more real, and that reality is the only reality. And this other constructed reality is the thing that we're calling people out of. People are sacrificing their lives for a lie, for a deception. That's the devil, in Girardian terms.
So how do we make peace? How do we begin that peace process in the midst of the nation as it is? You have the left and the right. You have all these little factions in between. You have these racial divides and gender wars and all this stuff. And it's real easy to come in here and pick a side and say, well, it's always the one who is the most scapegoated, but we don't have God's eye view. We can't really count people's value based on their scapegoat points because that would
Yeah,
be
I think
yeah,
the African experience may be enlightening here. I've talked to a couple. I've talked to a professor at Notre Dame who's actually African, Professor Congolay, and I made the mistake. I referred to I can't I asked him about tribes or tribalism in Africa, which of course is the way that people all over the world may identify. And he said I don't use that word. And I don't identify with that word. There are no tribes. And that is that the way that we work as human beings, we would reify our tribe. We are the people, and them other people, they ain't the people. Whether we're Navajo or Apache, American, Japanese, What we want to do is our tribe is the tribe. And the point in the actually, John said the same thing in the African experience. That what he recognized is you've got to get beyond the tribalism in Africa, literal tribalism. And of course, that's the way we all function as human beings. We may not call it the tribe. We may call it the white people, or we may call it the black people. But of course, as Christians, there is no slave, there is no free, there is no Jew, there is no Gentile. It doesn't mean that those categories are obliterated, but they're no longer the way that we do identity. We do identity not through a reified tribalism, whether it's republicanism or the democratic-ism, or that's just the way as human beings. So we're calling people from out of that reified understanding to recognizing, and this I'm very postmodern, but I think Jesus is very postmodern in the deconstruction of that reified tribalism, so that we bow down to these idols, that things that we imagine are more real than anything else, and they turn out they're just dust. They fade. You can't get a handle on them.
So, the way people are going to do that is mimetically. So, how do we model that for people in a practical sense?
I think that this is Gerard appreciated this.
Yeah.
That yeah, there is no way around mimesis and imitation, and so I think that as Christians, that as followers of Christ, we're imitating our Lord.
Yeah.
And as Paul said, as I follow Jesus, you follow me. In other words, it is mimetic. I don't think as human beings that we have really any alternative to that. But what we have to understand is that the control that bad mimesis has perhaps had on us. Somebody steeped in this stuff, you really don't, as a little kid in Texas, could I have escaped Christian nationalism? It would have been very difficult. As a little white kid in the South, are you going to be able to escape racism? It's very, maybe, 50 years ago, it was nearly impossible. And we're all the byproducts of mimesis. We're all shaped by the place that gave us birth, and that been enculturated into. And we have to recognize that about ourselves, because what we're called to in Christ, in real Christianity, is always a calling us out of that cultural identity. Now, that doesn't mean you'll wipe out, the culture, but that aspect of reifying the culture as if that is the essence.
Well, how
That,
don't things tend to trend to the extreme? I mean, or what is the word where you get this, like, okay, we can't abandon our, let's say you're Irish and you want to have your Irish Celtic festivities and you wear your, kilts and your bagpipes and you do all your little things. I mean, it's very, I guess, that looks, harmless, but then it's very easy to go from that to, well, I do really like the Irish more than I like the Italians or whatever. It's very easy to go back to that. Is that, um, like, how do you have that, but not let that go there?
well, I think, first of all, you've got to recognize the truth of all those things. In Japan, this was easy because the Japanese are that identity, ironically, is a fairly recently constructed identity. That you can go back to the Meiji Restoration, 1800s, and you can see where they're making this up. Because there was no such thing as a Japanese national identity
Yeah,
prior to the 1860s.
yeah,
But so too, once you see that, well, you can see it all around you, that every tribalism, every reification, in Texas, it was you got your hat and your belt and your boots. that can be an identity and is an identity for a lot of people, as if that is there's an essence to Texasness that you just don't get in Kansas.
Is is that is that you know is part of the peacemaking process to steel man some of those identities that people have rather than tell them to tear them down? Should we steel man? Like if I've seen you criticize Donald Trump. Should we steel man Donald Trump and look at the best redeeming qualities of the people we dislike the most, or vice versa? If you hate Joe Biden more than anybody, uh, like should the process of your mind practicing peacemaking start with the practice of pushing yourself to steel man and strategically empathize with putting your shoes in putting your feet in the shoes of a Trump supporter or even a Trump himself? Has that helped you get to that process of peacemaking?
I think the way to peace is through Christ. And the way what happens in light of Christ is that there are no steel men. That though there are those who would present themselves as the man, as reified. This is every sovereign ruler, every petty dictator that's come along, that every Caesar that wanted us to bow down,
Yeah.
that that's the
I
here.
meant that in the sense Eric Weinstein popularized steel manning to be the opposite of straw manning. So instead of looking at the easy, assuming the worst of our opponents, we try to find the redeemable aspects. Is that a form of practicing peacemaking? Should we, if we're most irritated by this faction or that person, as a spiritual practice, learn to look at the positive things that we can glean out of them that may be admirable or good or something that could be reasonable if you could put your feet in their shoes? Is that what we should
I
do?
don't know that. I think it depends on the situation that you're in and what strategy. That was the thing that John Ashworth was saying to us in Africa. You can't say, you can't come up with a theory
Right.
about how you're going to make peace in Sudan. What you have to do is you have to deal with the people, with the personalities on the ground,
Yeah.
and work from there. And so I don't know that I have some grand
Yeah.
theory about it, but I know in the what I'm most familiar with is in the Japanese context. In other words, as a missionary to Japan, you could go the wrong way two ways. So let's steel man the Japanese. Oh, the beauty of the samurai, the essence of all things, the tea ceremony, that the Japanese mind is the most unique mind in the world. That, in other words, that some of this needs undoing. Not all of it. Are there unique characteristics about the Japanese? Oh, absolutely. Are they the most unique people in the world because they have unique brains and unique? No, we've gone. In other words, that and this is a process we all have to go through. That it's not a rejection of culture. It's not a rejection of anybody's humanity, of the beauty that is always there in a culture and a humanity. But it is an undoing of the reified aspects of that in which, and that's always the tendency, is to set up the idol, make something, that is essentially nothing, make it everything. And that's always the danger. In other words, if by steel man, that certainly we have to have an appreciation for humanity and for other people, but that appreciation doesn't mean that they're right. In other words, I think we have to be able to name the idols and
Yeah.
do it. This was a thing that even Francis Schaeffer, I appreciated this about him. He said it's a very cruel thing to destroy somebody's world. And he's right. In other words, you can do this in a cruel way, and I don't mean that at all. But you can also do it in a loving, gentle way, and you may have to figure out on the ground what that is, how it is that you draw someone out of their. I mean, what we're talking about is religion here. whether it's really religion or
Right.
not. It functions as religion, this reification of the human condition as we have it. We have to draw people out of that tribalism, that kind of matrix in which things are constructed, and things that really do not have an essence in and of themselves. Then, the tendency is to make them essential, and we need to demonstrate, oh, that's empty. In our culture, capitalism, money, we'd do everybody a favor if we could we could show that's not the highest value. And there's not really anything behind the capitalistic system that this value system that
See,
we
that's
even
an example of like how what I'm trying to talk about is like, so we are not in a civil war, hot war right now in America, but we want to pontificate and send our missionaries out to solve all the world's problems that are hot or not. And I think we better start practicing ourselves. And I trying to do this because I don't want to hear about another, honestly, person who wants to advocate for universalism or the radical love of God who is talking foul about all the Christians who miss it, or vice versa. So I look at people who have violent Christian eschatologies and I don't say, hey, I want to beat you up verbally. I want to say, where can I meet you where you're at and pull you along the way to let you see the Christ that I've encountered? I don't
yeah,
want to
yeah,
look at you and say, you're the dumb Dr. Dobson. What a dummy you are. That's
yeah,
not
yeah.
being Christian. I got to learn to figure out how to swallow my pride and say, Dr. Dobson, he's dead now, but can I
Did he
show
die?
you
I
something that
didn't
I've
know.
seen here
Yeah.
without making you feel like you're an inferior person to me? That's what I'm getting at.
I experienced this, David, generationally. And so I know exactly what you mean. That is, I'm of a generation that I've gone through several shifts, partly because of leaving this culture and coming back. But I understand that most people of my generation and older, I'm talking things and saying things in theology and Christianity that it's incomprehensible. That doesn't mean that I pass a judgment on the generation from whom I inherited this faith, but I think it also doesn't mean that I have to stay there either. So I think we do have to be charitable to everybody. I mean that we're all part of this. We're all missionaries, and we're all meeting people, and we're all in the process of. I don't know that I like the word contextualization. It's a bit too flimsy for me, but it can work. So yeah, maybe I'm not very good at this, what you're describing. Actually, the one of the guys that works with me here, Brad, he's probably much better at it than I am. I'm not. I'm from Texas, by the way. Well, this thing may not come naturally for me. But yeah, the idea is that we have to be gentle and loving and approach people where they're at, and also recognize that we may be working in a completely different paradigm. That it that I'm well aware that
Right.
the place from which I came, even the school that I used to teach at, I don't blame those people for the their attachment to things like, well, their attachment to a violent Christianity. I mean, really, penal substitution, a violent notion of God, because that's all they've ever had. That's what they've been steeped in. And so,
Yeah,
but
but people come from pain, people come from pain, and that needs to be acknowledged about. I think the left should lead and help lead the right in love. I haven't seen, I'm going to tell you this directly. I have seen the right way more open to listening to the liberals and leftists than I have vice versa. And that's sad to me because the left should be leading this. I don't really care about the labels, so forgive me for using these flimsy labels, but there's a general trend. I don't feel like I fit in with any camp, but I have found my weird heterodox ideas much more easy to connect with people who would generally be considered not leftists. So maybe they're whatever, but they're not leftists. But people who are leftists have this tend to, and I want to break bread with them. I want them to come alongside with me. But there's this kind of intolerance there on the left. Everybody knows it. That, the liberals say it all the time too. Bill Maher says it all the time. I don't care for his politics either, but there's this general thought that like there's this level of intolerance to the maggots. If you ever said anything positive about Trump, you are Hitler or Hitler adjacent, and there's nothing else to be said. And that's got to stop because we can't get anywhere at the left, which is the one that is most espousing of the terms nonviolence, the most likely to read a Gandhi biography book, should be the ones who pick up the cross first if they're practicing what they're preaching more than the other guys. And yet I don't see that. I see people who preach fire and brimstone much more tolerant to say, "Hey, what do you have to say? You're different." And I think that's so weird that that we're in that conundrum, and I want to solve it. I mean, not solve it; it's fixed. I'm just saying I want to be able to help break some of that ice and facilitate a whole new, because there's millions of podcasts, there's millions of little pulpits, and there's
Yeah.
millions of opportunity to be a positive mimetic contagion for something better than what we've done so far. You know,
David, you're probably more of an optimist than I am, and even to enter in, I don't really do that game of left and right, and
yeah,
I know that sounds silly at some level, but yeah, that in other words, that to imagine that either of those is some sort of more redeemed or more, I just see, in other words, I don't have much hope for the politics of man because those politics are always going to be in this kind of divisive dualism, and I think we're just experiencing the extremes of that now. But you know what may be worse than that is kind of a blind understanding that we Americans, are the Christian people, and at least at this point in time what has come about. I mean, I think we're in a very divisive period that it's hard to find anything redemptive. But I think what is this point that, in Desmond's terms, may be a godsend is to understand, oh, this isn't resolvable in bringing the left together with the right or the right together with the left. This isn't, we're not going to get the Hopi and the Navajo to accept one another on an equal basis. We're not going to get the Hutus and the Tutsis unless they're all willing to abandon those tribes, those labels, and to accept the humanity of the other group. And the only way I see of doing that is in and through metanoia, is in and through real world conversion. I don't invest much. And by the way, I'm in the middle of this is Trump country. We're hard, this is a hard right wing red part of Missouri. It doesn't get any redder than this. And I, of course, I mainly am communicating with people that are hard right, but that doesn't define them for me. That's not, I understand. But you know what? I already learned this in my understanding of denominations. As somebody's a Methodist, does that mean I'm going to pick on their Methodism? Or if somebody's a Baptist, or I don't assign any weight to those divisions that we can put full weight on. I just see that to imagine we can divide the world up, Republican, Democrat,
not that we
Methodist.
divide it, that we find tribes in our society doing that themselves. So we're being compassionate just like we would if we went to Africa and they call themselves a tribe. I don't care what the guy back home in America says. If you're in the tribe around them and they call themselves that, you're not going to say, well, you imagine that, and I'm imagining it with you to imagine that you're a Houthi. No, I'm going to say, okay, that's what you call yourself. Let me work with you where you are.
Right, right,
That's
right.
what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
No.
So you can't do what you're saying that you can just escape the left or right. Every time you talk in this country, you're going to be around Hutus and those.
Oh no, I can. I can escape it.
I mean, you can escape it in the sense of not picking a team, but you have to
If
love people where they're at,
if I
right?
would if I would
Yeah,
go to Africa,
yeah,
I think that in other words, this is I'm talking to people on the ground in Africa. How are they dealing with this?
yeah,
They're not dealing with it by respecting those tribal boundaries. They're dealing with it by saying we need to get rid of the tribal boundaries.
yeah.
And that's the way I would deal with it here. I don't think it means a whole lot.
No, I don't
We could
either. I
we
don't
could
either.
invest a lot of time and energy in this thing and take sides.
But I'm
Uh,
not taking sides either. I'm saying trying to bring peace together to people, and you got to deal with
right.
people where they're at. Yeah,
And I think you got to call them, in my own simple-minded way, the politics is not going to save us. Uh, we're not going to be redeemed by Republicanism or the Democratic Party. We're not going to avoid war. We're not going to, we're not going to prosper and flourish as human beings just because we all identify with
yeah,
a particular political
yeah,
party. So my task in life is not to any kind of political alignment. I have a singular task,
yeah,
and that is the I see that we're calling people to Christ. I think we have to say what that means.
yeah,
We have to say, well, if you're going to do this thing in reality, come out from among them. Come out from among them and no longer identify as primarily any of those things by which this world would identify you.
yeah. But I think that I agree with you. I just think that there's a. Um, I'll give an example that will again irritate people, but that's fine. Um, Tucker Carlson. Okay, he's hated by so many people and whatever. But from my perspective, and everybody can criticize, and I'm not holding him up as the star that I've always wanted to lionize, but I see that as someone who it seems like, in a few cases, including right now as we speak, has used his platform and his connections to people with power over starting wars to try to demonstrate the need to not go to war with Iran or to kill Palestinians. So that's an example where someone has become a part of the native, so to speak. They haven't said, Trump, until you deny your republicanism, I will not step foot into your White House. You are in the world and I'm not. He walks into the world with them. And from that solidarity, he's able to say, hey, I'm doing a show here with the Palestinians being shot at on my show on the eve of your ships coming and surrounding that. Now, we could take Tucker and pick apart every other policy he's had or said something offensive here, there, and dismiss him as just another person who's in the world. But I see that as redeemable and beautiful, that someone has that kind of power, and instead of playing it easy and going along, uses it when necessary to press for the defense of stopping war, to stop war, and to bring empathy towards Muslims and those vulnerable in places like Palestine. So that's an example of how I think we should, be in the world but not of it. And I want, when I see him and Chink Uger come on together or Jimmy Dore, I think that's beautiful. I see the left and right figures coming together there, and I don't care if they're still using terms that I think I've gone beyond as a Christian. As a Christian, I think, wow, this is a positive step of Christ's peacemaking spirit interacting with this lower level of violent politics, and I like it. I like the conversation I see there. I want more of that. You know what I mean? I don't want that to be a rarity. I want that to be a common thing, you know?
Yeah.
That's the kind of thought I have in the peacemaking there.
Yeah, I think that maybe I actually haven't followed Tucker
Yeah.
Carlson, but as I understand it, he's kind of gone through what might be called a conversion,
Yeah.
in his understanding. And so I think that the thing that he may be seeing that is very difficult for people to see is that the Palestinians are human too, that Palestinians don't deserve the kind of genocidal treatment that they've received at the hands of the Zionist
Yeah.
Christians and the Zionist state in Israel. That's not anti-Semitic to say that Palestinians are human, that they shouldn't suffer under genocide. And so just these ideas, that's what I understand Tucker Carlson has become controversial, maybe because he's given up on a kind of blind Zionism. Yeah, that's a commendable thing. And I think that part of the thing that we need to do as Christians is just detach ourselves from these genocidal, understandings that in which we imagine establishing the kingdom of God
Yeah.
involves all out slaughter of our fellow human beings.
Right.
It's the most antichrist. I mean, we can overuse that term, but I think we have to get John's picture of the antichrist. We often think of the antichrist as this kind of demonic figure that we could all recognize. But of course, what John is saying, oh no, the antichrists are sitting next to you in church. And they've tweaked this just a little bit. They've just said one little thing, that Jesus Christ has not come in the flesh. In other words, they're going to have a disembodied Christianity. They're going to have an otherworldly Christianity. I think that we're surrounded, and maybe the church has always been surrounded by this kind of antichrist,
Yeah.
but is always claiming the name of Christ. See, that's the thing. We think if somebody quotes the verse and they say in the
Yeah.
name of Jesus, but that's precisely what the antichrists were doing in the first century. That's what they're doing today. And so just because somebody names Jesus or somebody identifies with Jesus, that in fact doesn't identify them as a follower of Christ. That may, in fact, that's the strategy of the Antichrist.
Right.
And so if they're not doing what Christ called us to, love of neighbor, love of stranger, welcoming the foreigner, the concern for the poor, the overcoming of, our racial prejudices and hatreds in which there is no enemy. We don't have enemies as Christians because once you love your enemy, he's not your enemy.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And I think that that the paradox, of course, is that most people who are just ordinary folks, or even people who are powerful and rich or whatever, who, should have had better education or something, whatever that means, um, don't really know what they mean when they say they are Christian, right? And so we
Yeah.
have the paradox of, on one hand, you call someone an antichrist for saying Christ but living the opposite with violence, but yet that's everybody, including myself. If we're in our thoughts, we have bad thoughts or whatever, even if we're not out there calling for genocide, And so it's a paradox. Is that the process, as Gerard would say, is the Christian conversion is to recognize that you're a scapegoater,
That's
and so the Christian conversion is also to recognize that you're the Antichrist before you can start to work on other people's Antichrist ideology.
when I was a child, in Texas, I had a kind of a hero, he's Johnny French. I mean, he is a real cowboy.
Yeah,
He even had a cowboy name. And Johnny he worked for my father, but he was an alcoholic. And just he would come and work. My dad, he didn't really keep track of anybody, but I went out one day and Johnny was so dead drunk, he was sitting on the pavement. He couldn't hardly move. And I just loved this guy. I just thought he was great, And so I'd just become a Christian myself. And I was trying to help him. I wanted to tell him about Jesus because I thought, man, this guy, he needs something. And so I said, Johnny, are you a Christian? And suddenly he kind of sobered up and he looked at me and I could tell I made him mad. And the last thing I wanted to do was make him mad. And he said, what do you mean, am I a Christian? Don't you know that I fought in World War II? That I was in the bomber planes, that I was, he was actually under the bubble under the plane, the most dangerous position. Don't you know what I've given up for this country? And as a 13-year-old kid, I didn't know, I couldn't understand what he was saying to me. But of course, what he had done is what I guess that's just that's the situation in this country. He thought that that was Christianity and that for him there was no, once you've done that, once you've fused your religion with the nationalism, there's no redemption for you because that's all there is. And I think that that's what we're up against is that the grand tragedy of this is not simply the Christian nationalism. It's not simply, but it's once you've gobbled up the Christianity that was there, and this is Gerard, by the way,
Yeah.
once that's gone for you, once you've made the religion a scapegoating religion, there's no redemption for you.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like the way in which the enemy other distinction happens, not just with the politics, but like I said, every form of identity. Online, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's become quite fashionable to attack boomers, to say, okay, boomer, or, you're a boomer if you don't understand what's going on, or, you're typing in all caps,
Right, right.
replying in all caps angrily. They say, well, okay, boomer, chill out.
They
And
don't
there's
say
this,
that to me because no, that's who I am.
but but my point is just to say, like how do we redeem the boomer, so to speak, in the sense of there's a lot of anger right now, again, cutting across left and right. Gen Z and so forth are angry, and millennials feeling like, the economy's collapsing. 12% of them were married and owned a home now at the age of 30 or something, and it used to be like 55% just a few decades ago of the country would be married with a home by the time they're 30 something. And so there's a collapse of wealth in this country. They're mad at the boomers because they believe the boomers are still obsessed, like they acted like they were going to be so great with their hippie peace and love, but then they turned out to be John Kerry and George Bush and Donald Trump. The
Yeah,
hippies
yeah,
grew
yeah.
up and they got the wars, and they got their homes. They've got two homes. They're always on perpetual cruises. They're always telling their kids to get out of their house and get a job, and yet they don't recognize that the economy that they had is absolutely gone. And there's a lot of anger there, and yet, I've always tried to defend boomers and say, hey, don't be so quick to wish, your parents' generation's absolute wiping out of the earth. You have a little respect and try to redeem the good elements of what you see there. What do you think about that? In
I
this,
did a piece on this because I'm kind of in the middle of this. Obviously, so in what I see as having happened to in this and the way that it relates to Christianity, that there was that moment in this country that Time magazine described as the greatest revival in American history. And it was my generation. It was the hippies, the youth culture, drug culture. It was maybe just the rock and roll culture meets Jesus.
yeah,
That just happened all over this country. I don't know if you know the thing. What was it? The Jesus people. They actually did a film about it in California. I wasn't aware of all of those people, but the same thing happened to all of us. And so you got to ask, well, what happened to that my generation? And of course, there was a moment, I think a beautiful moment for my generation but that there really was a time of coming together. We're not going to do this denominational thing. We really are just going to be followers of Jesus. And so this gets taken up, I think, in the church, but it, that in the alternative music, um, in the beginning, I was a big fan, of Larry Norman. I don't know if do you even know who Larry Norman
Oh, who's
is?
that?
He was, he was kind of he's what some would say is the father of contemporary Christian music. So he was a rock and roll music. He's a rock and roller, real rock and roller, and had all the glamour and everything. He became a Christian,
Yeah.
and he started singing. He said, "Why should the devil have all the good music and songs like that?" Just you know, and so there was the shift in music. I think the shift in uh, worship, but beyond that. In other words, what survived? And that's what I've had to ask myself. What happened to my generation is what I'm saying. Uh, I think that unfortunately, the Christianity in the period of Ronald Reagan, from the Republican
Yeah.
Party, that so much of my generation that had been part of a kind of new revivalism got absorbed into right wing Republican politics. And so you go to church today, do you see, did my generation have an impact on the church? Well, maybe in the music, but I've gotten where I can't stand the contemporary. It's gotten so bad. Maybe people they'll raise their hands now in church, kind of the Pentecostalism, but they do that now everywhere. Maybe not the loyalty, but in other words, that thing was lost. That kind of hopeful, joyous moment was lost for my generation. And I think because there was no depth there, there was not a depth of theological understanding. That is, you've got to pin your Christianity into a real transformation of the mind. And I'm afraid what happened, my generation just got absorbed back into the structures of the church as it already existed. And so that group that, you know, uh, at one time did not have any loyalties, they got maybe they got reabsorbed with less loyalty, but it's almost non-existent as that my generation has not had an impact. The difference that in my experience, in other words, I'd say is that, and I'm not alone in this. I know of other people of my age, for whom did this have a lasting impact? I think it's those of us who took this whole thing deeper than a kind of experiential Christianity. Unfortunately, I'm afraid my generation was real big on experience. That is drug experience, religious experience, it was all the same thing. But there was a portion of us who took it deeper and maybe inspired by people who are now passé, but nonetheless, I think I don't read Schaeffer anymore, but there was a time when he was influential. I don't think I think he was modernist. I think he was limited, but I don't judge him for that. So I think that there needed to be a depth of conversion. And what I mean by that is a theological understanding embracing the peaceableness of the gospel.
Yeah.
In other words, we were talking about peace. We were talking about anti-capitalism. We were doing all that, but none of it held, none of it
Yeah, that's what I'm
stayed
saying.
in.
They're still on their perpetual, whether they're, it's not, you said republicanism, whether it's Democrat or not, or
Yeah,
Republican,
yeah.
they're on perpetual cruises. If you call randomly, flip through your phone book and call a boomer, they are on a cruise right now, one out of two chances. And I don't mean that to make fun, but there's a sense in which all the wealth is being hoarded by this generation that still wants to live like they're 20. And I'm trying to say, well, how can we redeem this situation? Because the Gen Z people, left or right, are just sharpening the knives. Like, when are these guys going to die? Sick. And I'm thinking to myself, well, with modern technology, you're going to have another 15, 20 years of the boomers, hanging on and stuff. So how do we redeem this battle between generations where you got one generation that doesn't want to retire and uh, doesn't want to realize that it's not the main character anymore, and that it's hoarded its main character persona for itself for a long, long past its due date. And
Yeah,
yet,
yeah, we've been kind of the elephant that has
yeah,
trodden through, the American history,
yeah,
but not to good effect, I'm afraid.
yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not hoarding any of that will.
I'm not saying you are. Well, there's a return of the youth are converting in mass droves to traditional Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Do you think boomers are going to follow suit, or are they going to have their own final story that you think could be something different? What do you think?
I'll be honest, the guys that I graduated from, I'm on the outs with there would be nobody that is of my generation that is like-minded.
Wow.
That I'm alone in
Wow.
turn. Well, by the way, I've lost two of my best friends are dead now.
Oh, wow.
But that no, I went to school with people and seminary with people, and I'm guessing that none of the people that I was, would have identified with, when I began, they they would they would write me off as well, something went wrong with him.
Yeah.
So no, I'm alone as far as I know. I'm very much a minority in terms of my generation in my theological journey. Uh, and it's been a wild ride. I mean, maybe just because of being in Japan and then coming back to this country and in Desmond's terms of godsend, I've had several godsends moments in which I just, the one world or one understanding or one paradigm that can so easily captured us. I've been able to move out of that. And of course, I don't know, you've done Thomas Kuhn, this is Thomas Kuhn's point about the old scientists. Some of them are never going to change. You just got to wait for them to die out.
Yeah.
That's not that, and I understand that for most of my generation, it's beyond the pale. The place that I think the gospel takes us. It's beyond their, capacities to go there. But that's okay. That's just the human condition.
Well, but there's always time to be a good mimetic role model for those that come after you. You know,
I hope that's
because
my whole.
what's coming around the pike could be, the younger generations are demanding authoritarianism on left and right style. Down with the fascists with violence. Down with the communists with violence. There's a violent hunger for that kind of strongman politics and that attitude returning. And there's no time like now for older generations, not just the boomers, to model a peaceful way and show them how to do it so they know it's possible. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I hope that's, among my own students, I've seen several turn to Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy to Catholicism. I hope it's not a turn to an authoritarian, a reification of the institutional church. I don't think it is. So I do think that people are renegotiating this. I'm afraid that if people, and I'm not, any group, I think we all have to negotiate this. But if you go to Orthodoxy or Catholicism or whatever, Presbyterian, it doesn't matter where you're going, and you imagine that in this institution that they've got it right and that they've overcome, well, you've misunderstood. In other words, that's not the way that Christianity functions. You may find good Christian fellowship and good Christian brothers and sisters there, but you've also then got to stand back from whatever group it's that you're a part of. If you're going to be a good Roman Catholic and you buy into the just war theory, you're going to have to figure that out. The violence thing actually plays into all of these groups. If you're going to go to Eastern Orthodoxy, that group can be one of the most nationalistic, violent, doesn't have to be, but it can be. In other words, none of these institutional forms is, I think, going to, in some authoritative manner, being going to be able to hand you an authentic, diluted Christianity. I don't think that the answer is in that it is in a return to that institutionalized understanding. Now, that doesn't mean you may not. I'm not advocating that somebody, maybe you do find fellowship, maybe you find something better there, but you can also find that the back door of any of these groups has as many people streaming out the back door as are coming in the front door.
Yeah. Do you think that means you know that like Rene Girard has said that that the Jesus has that Christianity has failed. In other words, what it.
Yeah, it's always it depends on how you mark failure and success. If we're thinking of failure in terms of did Constantinianism actually succeed? No, it was a total failure and it continues to be a total failure. Can Jesus redeem us even though we may be part of a Constantinian Christianity? Oh yeah, there's hope for success even there. So the success and failure rate, if you just look around and you may judge the whole thing, and I know Gerard was tempted with this at the end of his life. And I understand, that maybe this thing has unleashed, this was Kierkegaard's point. Maybe Christianity has unleashed the demonic in the sense that the perversion of Christianity is worse than good old paganism. For Gerard, maybe the
Yeah,
undoing of the scapegoat mechanism is really going to end up being more disastrous than, the
yeah,
scapegoating religion.
that's what.
I'm not that pessimistic. I do think that, in other words, that there is redemption, that it is being worked out, but it is in that's not my field. That's not my job, is the cosmic redemption that uh, that's in God's hands.
Yeah,
And I do have hope. I do have faith that the world is being redeemed. It's just not being redeemed in the way that we would see it redeemed.
yeah. Ivan Illich said the same thing. The corruption of the best is the worst. In his interview with David Cayley at CBC is one of the famous lines that he would say. And
Yeah, yeah,
I had
that's
David Cayley on my show a few years ago. It was good.
we did too. We interviewed David Cayley, and I've been very interested in Ivan Illich. I think that he was a voice, and he's an example of a guy. He never left Catholicism. He
Yeah,
didn't see the need, but he's one of the people, one of the strongest voices speaking against, the Rome that Catholic. He was very, very, I mean, I don't know how to say it. He was a Catholic that was one of the strongest anti-Catholic voices you could have. So it's not that he wanted to tear down that institution, but I think what he saw is you have to work from, that we're all in this thing some way. We're all in some
Right.
form of institutionalism. And we do, it's not that we tear down the institutions, it's just that we understand that brick building, that hierarchy, that human structure, that ain't going to save you.
Yeah, that's so true. I appreciate your time, sir. It's always great to have you on.
David, this is fun. I'm glad we did it.
Thank you for coming on so many times recently. We've had a lot of fun conversations, but I'm glad that we were able to do this today.
I always enjoy it.
And check out the Forging Plowshares podcast, where you can listen to Dr. Axton and his uh, co-hosts and guests coming on frequently. Anything else we can look forward to coming out on the show soon?
Well, we've started a series of podcasts with significant peacemakers around the world. That we started with John Ashworth in Sudan, and we're going to try to build on that. I'm continuing then to explore the work of William Desmond in both podcasts and blogs. So if you're interested in the work of Desmond, and then we're going to have the classes that deal with, I think, the very significant work of William Desmond.
Thank you for your time.
All right, Dave.